Okay, well, it's 2 o'clock here in Southern Ontario, or near Perth, Ontario, where Scott is. And we're about to engage with our 135th Capstone presentation. Congratulations, Scott, for stepping up to the finish line here as we begin your Capstone defense. Just a reminder for everybody that I will act as the chair of this proceeding. Scott's supervisor is Dr. Alex Sevnier, and his second reader is Professor Dave Schultz. Almost elevated you there, Dave. And Scott will have 25 minutes to present his research and his findings, and then we will engage in about 25 minutes of questioning. It will start with Dr. Sevnier, and then proceed to Professor Schultz, and then I may or may not use my right as the chair to ask questions. And we could do that 2 times around. We have lots of time left over. We'll open it up to others that might also have some questions. Scott, I will keep time of it. And if I think that you're going to be over your 25-minute limit, I will just give you a nudge from that. Okay. After the questioning, then the 3 of us, Dave and Alex and I, will leave this call and discuss Scott's capstone, and then we will come back and announce our decision at that point. This meeting is being recorded, and after a little bit of post-production, we will then also post this on our MCM website for infamy and forever, I guess. Thank you, Julia's phone. Okay, Scott, over to you.
Thanks very much, Terry, and thank you, Alex and Dave, for being here, and to all my cohort members in MC11 and a few folks from my original cohort. As most people know, I took a hiatus between my 2 years. And I want to thank some of my colleagues from Queen's and some other colleagues for coming today. And as I talk about my capstone, which I've called Prepare for Impact, a case study of the Queen's University alumni Twitter account, examining the determinants of message engagement. So with this capstone, I really set out to understand whether or not we can define impact in messaging, and to see whether we could create a working model for impactful communications, a framework that might help practitioners. I also wanted to understand the challenges that public relations practitioners face when attempting to implement impactful messaging. And the word impact itself is sort of ubiquitous in the everyday language of organizations, both in the private and public sector. So much so that for a number of years, it's been cited as one of the most overused words in the world of business and academia. The Oxford Dictionary defines it very basically as having a strong effect on someone or something. But I think the closest that we might come to in the literature, the PR literature, is the quantifiable effect of communication activity on the target audience. And that comes from the Government Communications Service in Britain, which has done a good job with some of the terminology. And despite this, impact continues to be used as a stated goal for communications, even though it's not really well defined. And in the literature, it's been cited as one of the most important objectives of communications without really being defined. However, the literature falls a little short of answering the question of what impact is, and for communicators who are attempting to achieve excellence in two-way symmetrical communications. And research in the field of public relations is scant. There are clues to what constitute the components of impact in the literature from other disciplines. It's not letting me advance, Terry. Oh, there, I have to do there. Specifically, I looked at marketing and healthcare communications, not corporate healthcare communications, but patient communications, where effective messaging is critical. And then I took my findings and applied them through a content analysis of the Queen's alumni Twitter account over a 1-year period. And just for comparison purposes, the Queen's alumni Twitter account has about 8,900 followers. McGill, by contrast, has 7,600, and McMaster has 11,000, almost 12,000. So today I just really went through the introduction. We're going to talk through the literature review, my research questions, methodology analysis, the limitations I found in this study, and then talk about some knowledge mobilization and my acknowledgements. So in the big picture, impact can be a matter of life or death. And for marketers, they understand that from a brand perspective. Marketers are responsible for, often responsible for the bottom line in corporations. And so it's important, very important to them that their communications be impactful and engage audiences. For healthcare professionals, it can be a matter of life and death. Meaning and relevance can be the difference between life and death, and their sole goal is to help the patient understand what they're saying to them so they can take action and make a difference in their own health. There's considerable research in healthcare around this, right down to the use of specific words, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But PR doesn't have a common set of terms, and there's some evidence in very recent years that that's starting to happen, but it's not very well developed. So I want to talk about, I broke my literature review, which is quite extensive and very important to my particular capstone. So I'm going to spend probably a bit more time on it than some would. I broke it into 3 chunks: the big picture, the practice, and theory. So in terms of the practice, opportunity and reality are often very different. Social media offers an opportunity for engagement, but practice is often much different. Practitioners are often too busy to take advantage of the tools. They don't necessarily have the knowledge or the skill sets to use them. And even in theory, the development of the excellence model largely preceded the mainstream introduction of digital technology that allows public relations practitioners to have meaningful conversations with publics in an ongoing and cost-effective manner. However, the advent of new technologies, and especially social media, has allowed public relations to bypass the traditional gatekeepers, such as the traditional media and press release distribution systems, and have direct contact with strategic publics. But it would be wrong to assume that they're necessarily doing a great job of it. Years after the introduction of Twitter in 2007, the literature suggests that most organizations were using it as an institutional news feed to report basic information about the organization and its activities, rather than a platform for dialogue with strategic publics. And Turner and Foss developed 4 sort of models of presence that practitioners maintain within the social realm. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them, but I'll mention all 4, but I'll talk a little bit more about 2 of them. And budgeted social presence, which is the lowest order, communicators focus on their own availability. And then it works through entitled social presence, where the focus, they limit the audience's access to competing messages. And in competitive social presence, their focus is on the nature of the message. Where we want to get to as communicators is invitational social presence that focuses on another individual and their needs, rather than the needs of the organization. And that's sort of a co-creative symmetrical relationship, but that requires organizations to embrace ambiguity and really understand the experiences of their audiences in a deep way, in a deeper way than they do now. And the C-suite is an important player in this. We've talked about this a lot through the MCM program, but there's a fear and lack of understanding in the C-suite when it comes to social media that persists even among communicators in the C-suite. A 2011 survey of executives found that while most professionals in the C-suite understood that engaging with publics on social media was valuable, they were also challenged by the lack of control. It's really about control. The ability to keep up with changes in the digital environment, and understanding best practices and the need to find effective ways to measure impact rather than just reach. And that's from the literature. The social media is always changing. And here's a quote from Kent in 2013 that really kind of sums up the problem for practitioners. Many professionals spend more time worrying about posting to their organization's social media sites than what their actual strategic communication goal is. And that comes up time and time again in different ways in the literature. So when it comes to theory, the literature talks about how the practice is wide and varied. So there's not likely going to be an all-encompassing theory for communications, for public relations, just because it's so different. It's practiced at different organizational levels for different purposes, and so a single theory will never probably be developed. And public relations theory as it applies to the digital world is relatively new. In fact, there's almost nothing before 1996. But there are elements of public relations that cross all aspects of the craft, like purposeful communications that are intended to advance an organization's mission, for example, is something that public relations practitioners consider as they endeavor to manage communications between their organization and their diverse publics. You can't look at public relations theory without talking about the four models and the excellence model. Press agency, public information, two-way asymmetrical communications, and two-way symmetrical communications. I spent a lot of time in my paper looking at persuasion theory because it's inherent in at least the first three of those models. Grunig and Grudig make the case that the use of persuasion in public relations is not a best practice because of its goal of influencing publics in a one-way symmetrical fashion. However, others point out that the literature points to widespread implicit as well as explicit use of persuasion within public relations activities such as fundraising, crisis communications, community relations, religious and political communications, and marketing and lobbying. But what is clear is that two-way symmetrical communication is key. Dialogue is what builds engagement. And dialogue helps publics reach consensus. And the literature really describes dialogue as a way of thinking or positioning your organization as much as it is a practice. And on the downside, and again, this is what scares folks in the C-suite, dialogue requires you to give up a certain amount of control. You are interacting with folks who really can interact however they choose, and it's not always positive. Ultimately, we want to get to an era of co-creation where the notions of participation, collaboration, and cooperation go beyond a discussion to one where communication becomes a process of meaning making and the creation of meaning and form that forms communities, according to the literature, to agreed upon shared meanings, interpretations, and goals between the organization and its publics. This perspective is long-term. It's not a short-term goal. So again, it's hard to measure and focuses on relationships rather than communications. And in marketing, the relatively new field of relationship marketing, consumer engagement is generated by a complex co-creative environment with multiple stakeholders and organizations where they create meaning and relevance through interactive experiences. And again, social media was really made for this. And it goes beyond engagement. It actually helps the organization make better decisions when you're getting that kind of co-creative feedback from your stakeholders. So now I'm going to move on to the analysis I did of the Queen's alumni Twitter account. Well, first I'll start with my research questions. Really, I wanted to really understand whether the literature could help characterize the attributes of impactful communications and help us develop determinants of communication so that we could build a predictive framework or model around impact. And then I wanted to look at how well that actually, how well the determinants of impact are being utilized in a communications environment currently. And then finally, can we build a tool or framework that could help busy public relations practitioners and others, including others in the C-suite, apply the determinants of impact and then measure that impact. So my methodology, I did integrated literature review where I looked at public relations, marketing, psychology, healthcare, a number of other fields. I did a single case study that looked at 355 tweets, which was all the tweets that the Queen's Alumni Twitter account produced between June 2018 and June 2019. Then I sorted those according to engagement rates and numbers of engaged stakeholders, so I could see how well Queen's was doing on its Twitter account. And then I coded those against the 4 models of public relations. So was the tweet press agentry? Did it represent public information? Or was it two-way asymmetrical or two-way symmetrical? And then I coded it against message type as well. Was it an event notification? Was it an obituary? Did it relate a news story? Whatever it did. And then I did a content analysis using the determinants of impact that I developed from the literature. So the general findings are pretty grim, actually. The Queen's Alumni Twitter account doesn't really have high engagement. Just 10 of the 355 tweets were above the post-secondary average engagement rate. Those are an American average, but it's the closest I could find and should be somewhat relevant. All 10 of those tweets cited events, homecoming, convocation in particular, very much dominated. A building opening really took care of the rest. And so they were very specific to one kind of communication. And press agentry and public information models, which, just as a reminder, Grunig and Hunt suggest is not actually representative of ethical communications in public relations. They dominated with 79% of the tweets. So here's a look at the 12 industries and their engagement rates in Twitter. The alcohol industry and higher education are actually the 2 highest, and I don't think there's a correlation there. But alcohol at 0.08% and higher ed at 0.079. You can look at some of the other industries here, but right on the far side, Queen's Alumni is there with 0.0013. So this actually made it difficult for me to look at some of the determinants of impact when I was doing my analysis, because they really just didn't exist in the vast majority of the tweets. So my analysis around my first research question, could we determine what the determinants of impact are, really the literature points to 5: interactivity, timeliness, segmentation, and planning. So with interactivity, it's critical to understand that publics have evolved from mere consumers of content to stakeholders with an interest in altering and adapting and producing content of their own. Stakeholder engagement is an interactive process. It begins with a conversation, according to Gropp, and this dialogue is important in helping stakeholders create social capital. But Kent warns us that dialogue is difficult because it requires engaging individuals, but others remind us that developing digital tools can help expand stakeholder experiences and brand participation. The sense of brand community creates emotional bonds and leads to the development of shared goals and potentially shared action to accomplish these goals. Timeliness, at its heart, communication is really about sharing meaningful information in a timely fashion. and the need for public relations practitioners to engage audiences quickly has been amplified by social media use because stakeholders frankly expect information instantly and in the moment. Segmentation, there's a general agreement about public relations academics and practitioners that we should understand our publics, but the literature documents many, many different ways to do this, and there's no sort of standard across public relations. And this is where I think we can learn from marketers who were early adopters of segmentation and made it a normal part of their professional activity. However, Grunig would disagree. He argues that it's the stakeholders themselves within a dialogical environment who decide they have an organizational stake, not the practitioner, and shouldn't view the active participants as a target. However, there's literature emerging that shows that it's a growing part of communications and social marketing, and it's been widely adopted by communicators. And it sort of makes sense that this kind of interaction requires planning. You need to deliberate and consider the relational experience that you want to have with your publics, and then establish rules to ensure trust, fairness, and freedom of thought. So this implies a need for planning. It's important to note, however, that even within planned communications environments, the ambiguous nature of dialogue will create dialogues that require situational response. So communicators have to be thoughtful and well planned, but they also have to be reactive. And the last one, and perhaps the most difficult one to define, is compelling content. The message needs to be compelling. That individuals are most likely to retain and remember information they determine if it relates to them and implicates them, or in other words, is self-relevant. This starts with information that they want to find relevant to their life, but that builds a brand community which creates emotional bonds. And despite the difficulty reconciling persuasion with the excellence model, it plays an intrinsic role in helping the public relations practitioner to engage publics. And it really is rhetoric, and it's one of the oldest forms of communications. So PR practitioners who want to produce compelling content to capture the attention of their publics, they need to satisfy their pragmatic needs for information and build a relationship through dialogue. Research also shows that content that evokes emotion includes evocative photographs and videos that can lead to the, especially when they have exemplars, someone can see themselves in, and that can lead to a deeper engagement with the content. And we know from healthcare communicators that the use of even one word over another can have measurably different emotional responses. One study, for example, found that the word ache had a more positive emotional response than the word pain. And that goes on and on within healthcare. So they've actually looked at messaging down to the word level to understand how significantly it can increase engagement. And then do the messages reflect the determinants? Yes, most of them were timely and planned because they were all about events. Almost none of the tweets was interactive. Only one was considered to be two-way symmetrical. And the top 10 tweets all had emotional pull for sure, but that emotion was sentimentality or poignancy around homecoming and convocation, and really nothing to do with the ongoing work of the organization. And it's interesting to note that the mandate for the Queen's Alumni Communications Department is to just demonstrate the effect, the impact that Queen's is having on the world. And so none of these tweets that had real engagement really did that. And it is a segmented very broadly. I always talk about how my wife and daughter graduated from Queen's 30 years apart, and they get exactly the same communications. So it's not, they're segmented as alumni, but that's it. And this is just a chart that looks at some of the percentages I talked about. You can see that the use of video and photography is very, very low. And so is any interactive request seeking a reply, asking for someone to post something. Can a tool be developed? Very quickly, because I'm running out of time. An easy to remember tool is conceivable. The literature points to mnemonic, no, I can never pronounce that, aids that help memory. So I built a quick little acrostic here that spells out the word impact. Is it immediate, measurable, planned, active, or interactive, compelling, and targeted? So this is a very early model, but a tool could be developed to help busy practitioners who, let's face it, many of whom have no formal, necessarily any formal public relations training, never mind a theoretical background. Limitations, this was a single case over a limited period of time. I did not consider frequency or timing or subject matter, gender, ethnicity. The literature on social media is potentially outdated. If it's a few years old in social media, that's a lifetime. And organizations don't live exclusively in the digital environments. There's much, much more to Queen's alumni than its Twitter account or even its social media account. And then coding in concepts in the real world can be challenging. I want to reorient Queen's to reflect the organizational goals, test the impact tool, use it as a benchmark, broaden the analysis to other channels, and then for the practice, emulate marketing and healthcare more closely, press for practical models, develop a standard measurements, take this on the road to CPRS, CCAE, and maybe develop a guidebook. And that's it. I don't know how I did for time, Terry.
31 seconds. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well done.
I would like to thank you and
Time. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Alex and Dave, and I would like to single out Janice for, you know, my career in MCM was split by a hiatus, and Janice was really my ongoing connection with MCM in many ways. I want to thank my family for pretending to be interested. And I want to thank the MCM 11 for taking me in, and I thank the folks from my original cohort here for supporting me as well, and my Queen's colleagues who may or may not be here today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for a very interesting study, one that is relevant to what you're doing today in your workplace, and hopefully it can help you pivot and find ways to help you do your job a lot better. So I want to open the floor. Just a reminder, we have 2 rounds. We'll begin with Dr. Sevigny and then Professor Schultz, and then I may or may not decide to take my leave, and then we'll do it once again. So Alex, over to you.
Great. So thank you, Scott. That was a very thorough presentation of what I think is a really well-written and thoughtful MCM capstone. I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed working with you on it. So congratulations on getting to this point. You make a lot of intriguing points throughout it, you know, and one of the ones that intrigued me the most was actually a comment that you make towards the end, where you discuss about there being a disconnect between theory and practice. And I know you and I have kind of gone back and forth on this you know, in personal conversations, right? As you wrote this, and maybe you could summarize your thinking on that and what you mean for the group here.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, there are lots of models of effective communication, and in practice, we're a practice that's striving to professionalize, but doesn't really have professional standards that are applied universally across the practice. And I think that there's a frustrating gap between what the theory says good communication should be and impactful communication should be, and the tools that are built out of that theory to help practitioners on the ground. And I would like to see that gap narrow. And I think that, you know, programs like the MCM program, where we now have, at least I hope we have shortly, 135 alumni who have the the theoretical grounding to take that theory and apply it in their workplaces because they're professionals. I would like to see us work as a group of professionals to actually try and narrow that gap by building tools that folks can use, not only to create impactful communications, but tools that they can use to convince their organizations to resource public relations in a better way. So we move beyond, budgeted social presence to invitational social presence because we actually have the time and the resources to do that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that answer. Terry, do you want me to ask a second question, or do we move to Dave and then?
Go ahead. No, go ahead. One more.
Okay. So I do have a second question. This is more of a data question. And I noticed that that there's a, speaking of theory and strategy, Queen's, I didn't know that, and before you did the study, I didn't know that higher ed was so compellingly dialogical on Twitter, although it makes on social, although that it does make a lot of sense. And I see that your team in the study doesn't come out as quite as dialogical as the benchmark, right? Or as the best practice at least. What do you, like, having combed through this data now for a year's worth of data, what do you think that was, and how has doing this study led you to maybe starting to shape a strategy?
Yeah, so I started this, so that period, I started at Queen's in the end of February in 2019, and this data set goes from June to the beginning of June to the end of June the following year. So I was spending that year actually building out a communication strategy for Queen's alumni, which didn't have one in place. It didn't have one in place before. And I had spent some time with our social media, but really not a lot. I knew that we were struggling, but it wasn't until I looked at the data when I realized how poorly overall we were doing from a dialogical or co-creative perspective. We essentially were using the tool as an institutional news feed just to push out information about what was going on or what was coming up or who did something that was reported elsewhere. And, I sort of feel like we were sending out press releases on a daily basis in 140 or 280 characters. We've changed a lot since then, and I'd like to go back and look at the data, which really constrained me from really correlating some of the determinants of impact I found in the literature, just because the data set was so small that actually contained those determinants. And I'd like to go back at some of the campaigns, the social media campaigns we've done since around alumni really working hard to overcome COVID or working hard to increase the profile of the arts in their communities. That was a campaign we did. And look at the engagement rates there and compare them to this sort of benchmark in this data of how we were doing before, and then go from there. So it's while I was disappointed in its ability to help me with this study, I am grateful for having the data to move forward with a comparative benchmark to see how we're doing in the future. And I'd also like to expand it into other channels so I can look at how we're doing around email, and LinkedIn is by far our biggest social media presence and those sorts of things.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex and Scott. Dave?
Yeah, so seeing Jane's name, it made me think of another question that I was originally going to ask you. So I'm going to jump in on that one. Jane looked at research around university presidents' communication, but she also looked at how people wanted to receive, where they expected to receive different information. And Twitter was pretty much seen as an information news source. And this was a couple of years ago. And you talked about LinkedIn. So, it'd be interesting to bring it over to something like LinkedIn and see what level of engagement or co-creation you have happening there. What is and I know you haven't done this research, but if you took what you learned now and what you know about Queen's LinkedIn activity, what sort of changes or differences would you expect? Because I don't think people look at LinkedIn necessarily in the same way that they look at Twitter from a news source.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Dave, and one that I've thought about. We've developed a channel strategy for Queen's alumni, but we haven't implemented it. So essentially, it's the same information, and a lot of organizations are like this, so I'm not singling out my own shop. It's the same information that goes across all the channels, which to Jane's study, there are people look at different channels for different things. I would imagine that LinkedIn would have a much more successful content would be content that engages people around career development and skill upgrading and the more philanthropic activities that are happening at Queen's with a LinkedIn audience. But that's just a bit of guesswork. We haven't done that analysis. I do agree that Twitter is seen as an information feed, but it's also true that people are heavily engaged in back and forth on Twitter, not always in a positive way, but it certainly there are plenty of Twitter accounts that have very, very deep engagement.
One more question, which was my original question. You touched on outputs versus outcomes as part of your, by the way, this is a great, a lovely paper to read. I very much enjoyed it. Well written. The literature review and the discussion comes together so well. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And the quote that you put up from Kent, when I was reading your paper, I paused to share that quote with my son who's doing media studies, because I think it's a very relevant quote. But talking about impact, output, and outcomes, is impact the measure that we are looking for, or is there something more? Is impact simply another form of output that we're at, or so it's a chicken and the egg sort of thing, I think. But where does outcomes and impact think, and do you need to have purpose added to the model because you have an end measure at that point? Can you comment on that?
Can you go back to that the page where, or the slide where you actually spelled out impact? There, thanks.
Yeah, so I think I think that is the $1 million question, Dave. That a lot of theorists are really trying to understand is what should we be measuring and how. And in practice, I'm not sure people even understand the difference between outcomes and outputs. But I think that impact is a result. When you've actually had that compelling force on an individual, the basic Oxford Dictionary definition, that's the result that we're seeking. And purpose, I think, is really found in the mandate. And that's why I pointed out that, while Queen's alumni did have some tweets that really seemed to have emotional value around sentimentality or the emotions folks feel around convocation, that's not their mandate. That is not their purpose. Their purpose is to demonstrate how Queen's is changing the world in a positive way. So, that really speaks to the strategy that you really have to develop in communications. So I think purpose is a little bit larger than this and sort of an envelope that this sits in. Was there another part to your question?
No, that was it. It's really like how does outcome and output and impact all fit together? But I think you explained that.
Yeah, we want to move beyond reach and actually measure the real engagement that we're having with folks.
Yeah, if I look at, you talked a little bit about bringing marketing into this, but if I look at the whole customer experience measure, this is the customer experience measure of social media in a large way.
Yeah, and it has to be, I work in the Office of Advancement, so our principal goal beyond alumni relations is philanthropy for the university. And that philanthropists know that that's a long-term relationship building practice. And I think that we could learn from philanthropists as well.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I think I just want to build on this notion. I think, Dave, you sort of used it as a throwaway, but the notion of intention. How do you, in fact, within this, and I like this impact. I think this works for our practice in our field, and it also helps on papers when we use these kind of things, because people tend to gravitate to more of these very applied and administrative kinds of perspective. But again, where does intention fall within this? Intention needs to have some kind of demonstrable indication in order for you to, in fact, measure it, right? What's the intent on? And Dave talked about, those three levels of output, outtake, and outcome. And they all don't have to hit an outcome. And they can be just in terms of output, but we have to, in terms of communication strategy, we have to understand what the intention is in order to be able to measure, hopefully, success.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess I saw, for the purposes of this tool, I saw this sitting within an intentional strategic plan, which is what I've built for Queens now. We didn't have one before. So, it's easy to look at that, the data, and say what a lousy job we were doing. But really there was no purpose articulated. So how could you even measure against what it is you were trying to produce? And one of the things that I've done within the organization is a bit of an experiment to see if I can focus attention on engagement. I've actually separated content creation from engagement. So one unit will produce the content, another unit's responsible for actually engaging folks with that content. Because I think there's this sense within a lot of public relations shops, and you create the story, you write the tweet, you push it out the door, and that's the end of the story. Well, that's actually the beginning of the story.
Right.
And so I'm trying to focus folks on that so that we can actually.
Yeah, because co-creation has to happen after you hit the send button, right?
Exactly.
That sense of dialogic engagement is something that you're building. I mean, we use it in pretty throw off terms, relationship, right? But a dialogue doesn't stop and start with, the return button or key as well. But I think, and I don't disagree, Scott, in terms of that notion of strategic intention at that higher level and purpose, but should across a multi-platform communications, shouldn't the communicator then have to answer that question? So what? What's the intended?
Yes.
What's the intentionality of this action that I'm taking?
Well, I'm glad you actually said that, because the way that my mandate at Queens is articulated is to demonstrate the impact of Queens on the world. So that the intention is actually built right into this model. So you want content that is impactful, but you want it to actually show the impact that your organization is having as well. So I do believe it's built. I didn't want to confuse the two different ways to look at the word impact, so I didn't include that in my paper, but it is actually built into this model.
Right. I will ask one methodological question. You have done a content analysis and you did it yourself. So how is this valid if you didn't have anybody else look at your coding? Because what we generally have is this sense of self-reporting or self-selection. And usually in content analysis, we would look at things like intercoder reliability. So how do you address this issue that is not valid because you didn't, in fact, there's too much bias in this?
Yeah, I think that is a potential limitation. I think more importantly, just the lack of valuable data in the content analysis was more harmful to the study, because I wanted to do a regression analysis on the variables and really pull it back, but I really didn't have the data to do that. In terms of having, so I did have our in-house data expert review the coding and help me modify some of it. So, but I didn't have any academic review beyond Alex as my supervisor.
You might just want to put in that you did have another party actually look at your framework, your modeling framework, or your analysis framework. That would help as well. Okay. Alex, do you have any other questions? We've lost Alex. Unmute yourself, Alex, if you're talking away.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted there. That's a good question about interquarter reliability. It's always something that we deal with for the validity of studies. My question was, how does this generalize? Like, how do you take this on the road? Like, because it's a single case study and it applies to Queens. So, what's your next step? Let's say you're working towards that guidebook. How do you get there so that when you present it to others, they can relate to the data, like either at other higher ed institutions or other places?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Alex. And I think that's why I made the point when I talked about my literature review that it was a very important part of this study, because this model, the impact tool model, was pulled out of the literature, not out of the Queen's data. And if I was going to develop this for the road, I think I would spend some time looking for examples from a variety of institutions that actually I can apply the model to and show how it works or doesn't work in some circumstances. I don't think I would rely on the Queen's data. I did that because it was at hand, and it's also important to me in my role as executive director to improve it. And this was an opportunity to really do a deep dive into sort of a benchmarking activity that we would not normally do.
Great. Dave, final question? You're on mute. You're good? Okay. So thank you, Scott, for that, and thank you for your elaboration and answers to the questions we have. So Alex and Dave and I will put ourselves on microphone mute and stop video, and I will call both of you, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes with the results of our deliberation.
Well, Scott, congratulations and welcome to the community of MCM alumni. We got together and we thought this was a very thoughtful and well articulated paper. So, congrats. You crossed the finish line, and you can put MCM after your name.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
I'd like to extend the congratulations, Scott. And again, we don't necessarily measure our success based on the distance of the run or the length of time it took to run, but by the fact that you've crossed the finish line, which is a very important threshold. And you've always been a present person when you were in the program. And that is very meaningful to all of us, that we can actually have a variety of people that are engaged in different ways and forms in the journey. Some sail through without anything touching them, and others that life intervenes. And I'd like to congratulate you on this. The paper was a very interesting, thoughtful, and revealing. I think the notion that I take away, the sense of self-reveal about something that you're involved with. So congratulations. You are the 135th graduate of this program. And as Alex said, as of this moment, you can apply those initials behind your name. We have paperwork to fill out, but you can consider yourself a part of the alumni family. And I now will think about all these immediate, measurable, planned, active, compelling, targeted email or model as we engage our MCM community in a way that is meaningful for each one of you as well. So I'll leave the last words to you. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I just want to say thank you very much. This has been a incredibly good journey. I really couldn't have done it without all of my fellow MCMers, but especially MCM 11, who really adopted me as an orphaned MCMer and made me one of their own. So thank you, folks.
Well, we're very grateful that they did that, and we're glad to have you part of the community. So celebrate tonight, raise a glass for all of us. We'd like to do it in person. When we reopen, hopefully you'll make the drive down to sign the alumni book at the Phoenix and drink from our Halo chalice as well. Absolutely. All the best. Congratulations.
you.